Hello, everyone, and welcome to the MoPod, brought to you by MoDate, where we discuss everything Mo, from modern orthodoxy to my opinions and more. I'm your host, Evan Harris, and we have a great guest for you today. Let's get to it. Today, we're sitting down with Dr. Naomi Rosenbach, clinical psychologist. How are you, Naomi?
Hi, good.
So let's dive into your background, who you are, and what you're doing now.
Sure. Okay. So I'm currently a clinical psychologist, postdoctoral fellow, recently received my PhD in clinical psychology. It's actually a second career for me. So I spent the first decade of my adult life in the business world. So I guess I'm not your typical postdoc, a bit older. And I practice clinically, and I also conduct research.
Gotcha. And so you've conducted a bit of research on the Shidduch Crisis and Shidduchim in general. So just wondering what got you interested in that and how did that come about?
Sure. So I started to think about this idea when I was back in undergrad. I started undergrad in my 30s. So here I was pursuing a degree in psychology, and I joined a social psychology research lab. So I started to gain an understanding about social research and really started to learn about the ways that you can produce social research, evaluate social problems, and start to intervene based on the data that you find. And at the same time, I was looking around my community and seeing friends and family that were really struggling with shidduchim. And I guess that was a perfect storm. I started to think about how can we approach this from a research-based methodology.
Gotcha. And just for our listeners, what community would you say you're from, if you had to put it in a box?
Okay. That's interesting. I really consider myself somewhere in between. I live in the five towns. I often say I have one foot in the yeshiva Orthodox community and one foot in the modern Orthodox community. I literally have children that are parts of both schools.
Gotcha. Yeah, I'm from Five Towns, so I hear what you're saying. Okay, so the name of the project that you're currently working on is what?
Well, the project that I was hoping to present today, it's titled Struggled in the Jewish Orthodox Shidduch Dating System, a large-scale qualitative analysis. And that was actually part of a bigger project.
Gotcha. And so what information are you looking for and what information have you found so far?
Okay. So I guess I'll jump into the history and the background of the project.
Sure.
We were originally, when I say we, so this was a project that I undertook in graduate school, and I ended up inviting others to work with me, and we ended up becoming a team of researchers doing this together. So we originally created the project with the goal of really getting hard quantitative data on the shidduch dating system. And what I mean by that is we were looking to find out, what does the shidduch crisis mean? What are the actual numbers? Is it true that there are a high percentage of people that are looking to get married within the Orthodox community and aren't? Are there more females than males available, as the Jewish media is portraying it as such? What are the percentages of marriage rates? What are the percentages of divorce rates? That was the original goal of the project.
And what have you found as the answers to those questions? I know that from just my conversations with people, everyone believes that I've spoken to that there is a shidduch crisis, but when you ask people numbers or anything like really substantial, nobody really has an answer. So what have you found through your research?
Okay, so nobody has an answer because a lot of people are making claims, and yet they're not research-based claims.
Yeah.
They're based on anecdotes, what they're seeing around them, or maybe there have perhaps been some super small scale studies done and they're basing it on, one class of individuals that they're following. But in order to really understand the hard data, we have to do these large scale studies. Our study was successful. And what I mean by that is we had thousands of people that answered that study, and it was designed in a way where we can start to understand these numbers better. Unfortunately, for today's purposes, I'm not going to be talking about the actual numbers because that study, that paper is still under publication, and I hope that we can give that information over to the community sooner rather than later. But there's another beautiful aspect of the study, and that's more of the qualitative information that came out of this, and that's what I hope to talk about today.
For sure, totally understandable. So, and we spoke about that beforehand. So I'm wondering qualitatively, first of all, where does the Shidduch crisis come from? Where did this concept come from? And do you believe it exists?
Can I respond with a question? What do you mean by Shidduch crisis? I think everybody means something different when they talk about it.
Okay, when I refer to Shidduch crisis, I'm thinking about the concept that there are that Shidduch dating is harder on women and that it is harder for females in the Orthodox communities to get married.
Okay. So let me talk about the qualitative aspect of that study. Let me just jump in and give a background of how we even got this information. So when we were piloting the study with the purpose of getting the quantitative information, so to be able to answer that question, is it true that there are more women available than men, and are they struggling in that way? We started to what's called pilot the study, which means just ask a few people to answer it and give you feedback on your question style. And these were very pinpointed questions, like how old were you when you got married? How many siblings do you have? How old were they when they got married, kind of thing. And as we were piloting the study and asking for feedback, people said, hey, we want more. We have so much to say about this subject. We don't just want to give you our hard information of how old was I when I got married and am I currently married. We need a space to tell you how difficult this process has been, either for ourselves or our kids or the people we know. And so I would say literally about a couple of days before the study went out on a massive scale, we decided to add this question because people asked for it. Ultimately, this became such a rich part of the study in and of itself. When the responses started coming in, and they came in rather quickly, the group of researchers, including myself, were just glued to the screens. We could not believe how rich and how well written and how poignant these responses were. And we realized that we must do justice to these voices, and we must gather these voices in a scientific way as well. So that's how this qualitative study came about.
Gotcha. So these responses were kind of just anecdotes about people's struggles with shidduchim and specifically women or family members of women.
Not specifically women.
Okay.
Anybody was able to answer this study. So married individuals, single individuals, people that were dating, parents of daters,
Okay. So
shadchanim, rabbis, rebbitzins. And ultimately, just to give you an idea of some numbers, so 3,865 individuals responded to the quantitative study.
mhm.
And of those responders, 889 individuals completed that optional text question of what I call the qualitative study and started to talk about their experiences or what they felt the problems were in the shidduch dating system. Some of these responses were a sentence or two, others were multiple paragraphs.
Gotcha. So about like 20% filled out the optional part, which is definitely a high number for people to fill out an optional section. And so from your findings, do you believe that the problem that I was speaking about exists? And also, why do you think it's so prevalent in Jewish media, as you said, as being this big problem?
Okay. Yeah. Um, so, do I think it exists? It's interesting. I view myself as sort of the silent researcher behind these voices. So as I answer this question, I will tell you that many females have expressed that this was their experience.
Mhm.
Parents of daters have expressed that their daughters are having a much harder time than their sons.
Okay.
So much so that it was one of the themes that were most repeated. So ultimately, we did what's called a qualitative analysis, and we read every single response multiple times. Multiple people read these responses. And in a scientific manner, we were able to code it and look at, well, what are the most prevalent themes that are coming out of this? And that question that you just asked me, I believe, is theme number 2. So the second most repeated theme was that women struggle more than men.
Gotcha. And what was theme number 1?
Superficiality in the dating system, so that we
Okay.
just become so superficial in the criteria that we assess compatibility.
Okay. So qualitatively, from your analysis, what do you think, if you had to summarize everything, people are looking for in terms of how to change the system? And do you think that overall people think it's the best that we can do, or that the system is actually broken?
The latter. I believe that people think the system is actually broken. Now, that's based on a bit of a biased view, and I'll say that. I've asked people to talk about the problems. I've read the many people's responses to those problems. So I may be getting a bit of a skewed view here. It's possible that if we actually ask 10,000 people to rate the Shidduch system on 1 to 10, lots of people will give it an 8 or a 9 or a 10. That being said, based on this research and based on the heartfelt statements that came really quickly, and I think that's important here, we did not put a lot of effort into marketing this survey. It snowballed pretty quickly, and I think that that is because people have so much to say about this subject. And unfortunately, not in the, not the most positive things to say, and that's based on their own experience and how much they struggled.
But do you think that's a general theme in research and like services like Yelp and Google reviews, where people were more likely to review things if they had a negative experience compared to a positive experience?
Absolutely, and that's a really big limitation of this study.
Gotcha. Okay. And so from your analysis, you also divided people, right, into subsets of orthodoxy, like I was asking before, yeshivish, modern Orthodox, different subsets. Did you find that people in different groups had different types of responses, or was everyone pretty much on the same page?
Um, it's both, and we didn't analyze every single item um, in a way where we looked at what were the big differences here. We didn't do that
Okay.
yet. I consider this paper that I'm talking about as like sort of the first step in this project. There's a wealth of data that we hope to write more about, and that's actually one of the things that we can start talking about, which wasn't highlighted as much in this paper, is like, okay, these are the big things that come out when, close to 900 people talk about their struggles. What are the big differences between men, between women, between yeshiva Orthodox, between modern Orthodox, between age groups? That being said, I will tell you, just eyeballing the data, there were 2 big differences that came out between the 2 socio-religious communities. With the first one being that one of the themes was that gender segregation is causing problems for a whole bunch of different reasons.
Mm-hmm.
And that was a much higher percentage of modern Orthodox individuals actually spoke about that theme, which is interesting.
Yeah.
One of the themes was that more education is needed in areas of intimacy and sexuality. And that one is not surprising, that a much higher percentage of yeshiva Orthodox individuals wrote in about that theme, with a much lower percentage of modern Orthodox individuals expressing that as a need.
Gotcha. Yeah. The gender segregation thing is definitely interesting
Mm-hmm.
and a little bit surprising that it's coming more from the modern Orthodox side, which probably has less gender segregation than you would imagine that the yeshivish world has. But maybe that's just because in the yeshivish world, it's just the norm, whereas modern Orthodox has kind of a split in there. Anyway, that's just my theory.
Yeah, I agree with you. I was thinking along the same lines. And from what I've heard, the modern Orthodox world, maybe over the last decade or two, has moved more towards gender segregation.
Interesting. Okay, that is something I did not know, but definitely interesting. I'm wondering if you yourself consider yourself a shadchan.
No, absolutely not. I made one shidduch in my life many, many years ago. It was kind of by accident.
All right, well, one is still good, but so do you think with the current, this is the MoPod, obviously more geared towards the modern Orthodox community, and I'm wondering about the systems in place, right? Shadchans, setting up friends, dating apps, and meeting at events. Just what do you think about these different systems? And from your analysis, do you think that certain ones are more effective than others, are
Mhm.
better than others? What are your thoughts there?
Yeah, there are a few themes that touch upon that. And that's actually exactly precisely what people are saying. So one of the themes, I don't remember the exact wording, but something along the lines of the current way the shidduch system is, based on this resume system, based on using shadchanim as a middleman, is not very workable or doesn't work well for us. So that definitely was something that people spoke about often.
Gotcha. And did they say why it doesn't work? And did you see answers specifically in the modern Orthodox community that supported one system versus another system more than the
Mhm.
other?
Yeah, I can. Yeah, sure. So what I gleaned from the information is that people feel like when they don't get a chance to meet somebody else, to meet somebody, a potential, marriage partner in a natural setting, they end up resorting to comparing resumes and comparing lists. And there's so much more to a person. So they might end up saying yes or no. And this goes back to the superficiality category based on some really superficial criteria. Um, and we all know that when we meet people, sometimes that criteria just falls by the wayside.
Do you have any examples of this superficial criteria?
Yeah, I can read you. So the paper is basically made up of quotes from the participants. So I can read you
All
some
right,
of the
great.
things that they've said. I think Orthodox dating can create some real issues in terms of how people look at each other, and it encourages thinking of people as a series of boxes to check off a compatibility list rather than complex individuals who it might be worth spending time with, even if they deviate from said list.
Okay. And are there any boxes that people spoke about specifically that they think are necessary, but boxes that they think might be less necessary? For
Yes.
example, let's say keeping Shabbos as a box versus, I don't know, like maybe politics as another box, or just what you do for a living as another box.
Mm-hmm. So, from my memory and from reading the responses many times, um, what people often spoke about were synagogue affiliation, schools that you might have gone to, not just your affiliation, but the affiliation of your parents, maybe sometimes going back to grandparents, right? Um, Jobs, definitely, what do you do for a living? Seminaries and yeshivos in Israel. Politics didn't come up as much. By the way, this study, the information was actually gathered quite a few years ago.
Gotcha.
I think before it became extremely polarized. Yeah, level of religiosity came up too, right? So what labels, you know, do you use? What labels do I use? Maybe we're more similar than we are different if we actually get to meet each other. And I'm not just looking at a paper that says Yeshiva Orthodox versus modern Orthodox.
Hmm. Gotcha. So just to talk about how Modate works, and because this is obviously valuable information for someone who runs a dating website. So from a religious perspective, we ask not for people to label themselves. We ask about Shabbos, Kashrus, Shomer Negiah, learning Torah consistently, and Aliyah. Whether or not you do those things and how important is it or want to do those things. Obviously, the word like do those things doesn't apply to all those, but whether or not you keep those halachos or want to make Aliyah, and how important is it to you that your match does those things. And so I'm wondering what your thoughts are on that, because let's say someone keeps Shabbos and it's very important to them that their match keeps Shabbos. They will not see the profile of someone who does not keep Shabbos. Is that a box that you think people would consider limiting, or is that a necessary box? Like, are there any necessary boxes?
Yeah, I believe there are necessary boxes, and I believe that what people were alluding to in this study is not so much so that there are boxes, but it's the nature of those boxes. And it's
And
more about labels than actually about a person's values or a person's personality. So keeping Shabbos versus not keeping Shabbos, here's where I guess I'll talk about my own opinion. Aside from the research, I think you need to know yourself, because some people can make it work with a potential partner where one is uh, keeping Shabbos and the other one isn't. But I think that lots of people, that might be a really big area of frustration for a lot of people, and they prefer somebody to be on the same page, especially if they're in the position where they're choosing somebody, right?
mhm.
So
So
yeah.
in the setup system, how are you supposed to, how is anyone supposed to set people up without this idea of boxes in a certain way? Of course, if you know both the people and you could kind of gauge their personality and come up with the idea, then that works. But if you're creating a larger scale system like a dating app or something like that, obviously some boxes are required.
Right.
So what is the whole setup system just not the right system, and we should just not have dating apps, not have people setting people up, just having more events or things like that? Or is there a way to amend what we
Mm-hmm.
have?
That's a good question. I think it's both, and I don't think there's one. I don't look at this based on my reading of the research. I don't look at this as a yes or no kind of question. And I think some things will be more workable in some communities than in others. So for example, if I know your podcast is more for the modern Orthodox community, but our research actually included both communities. So
Yeah.
a community like Lakewood is not going to go from a real shotgun setting up system to a completely co-ed system. It's just not going to work. But they can make movement in terms of, I think there are areas for improvement within their setup system. Moving to the modern Orthodox community, from my understanding of what people are asking for in this particular research project is that they're actually asking to be able to meet people on their own. People are tired of having to use a middleman. They feel like they're not seen well. And again, it doesn't mean that everybody feels this way, and it doesn't mean that even the people that are talking about this, it doesn't mean that they always feel this way, but we've gotten a lot of responses that are insinuating that people feel like they're not seen or heard by shadchanim, and they would like to be able to meet in a more natural setting. So
Okay.
yes and yes.
Very interesting. And so you asked me earlier, what do I consider the Shidduch crisis? So I'm going to ask you personally, what do you consider the Shidduch crisis to be?
Okay. Um, the struggles that people have in the dating and marriage process, above and beyond this concept that there are more females than males. I think women struggle. I think some men struggle. Even those that get married um, have spoken about the difficulties of the process along the way. People have actually spoken about difficult marriages. One of the most surprising, I would say maybe one of the only surprising findings that we found in this qualitative analysis, because all the other themes are like, yeah, that makes sense, heard that, know that, friends talking about that. The thing that surprised me the most is I believe it's number the third or fourth most repeated theme, which was that people feel pressure to get married way before they feel ready, and they rush into decisions. And while I've seen that anecdotally, I didn't understand, when people talk about the Shidduch crisis, I think they usually are insinuating those that aren't married yet that would like to be and are having a hard
Yeah.
time finding dates. But here we find this totally other, I don't want to call it a crisis, but let's call it a problem, a struggle that people are experiencing. And that's getting married too young and too quickly, not based on my judgment of that, but based on their own judgment of that. So I think it's kind of broad, the Shidduch crisis.
Do you think that maybe the idea that's put out there of the Shidduch crisis existing, the one that I was speaking about, that, it's harder for women to find someone, and so for a variety of reasons, people say it could be because there are just more women than men. People say it could be because men get the first choice in a lot of traditional shidduchim systems where they get to go first, and so there's way more options, and so it's much easier to say no. People say it could be because men become less religious at a higher rate than women do. There are just all these reasons that people
Mm-hmm.
give, but do you think that having this idea of a shidduch crisis out there can cause this reverse problem that you're talking about, people rushing to get married, and then it's not
Absolutely.
healthy for this idea to even exist?
Absolutely. Not only do I think that, I've since researched that, and that was the focus of my dissertation, which I did not talk about today. But the title of my dissertation was How Does Actual Sex Ratio and Perceived Sex Ratio Influence Mental Health? And it was really reading these responses from this qualitative study that inspired that study, because so many people were talking, so many women were talking about the mental health effects of being bombarded with this perceived Shidduch crisis and how it makes them feel. And I found, and this is a whole other area, I don't think we have time for this, but I did find that there are mental health consequences, increased depression, increased anxiety, decreased life satisfaction when there is an imbalance in sex ratio and when there is a perceived imbalance in sex ratio. But that also depends on a lot of things. Um, and that is available. Somebody can potentially search for that title of my dissertation and read through it.
All right, that's great. And so, since that's already published, did you find any? I don't know if this is possible to even find, but were there any quantitative findings about, is there an actual imbalance in sex ratio, or is it mostly just perceived?
So importantly, my dissertation wasn't focused on the Orthodox community as a
Mhm.
whole. I had a subset, but we have, the US Census has data on sex ratio. So that's what I focused on it. We don't, the quantitative data that we have as part of this bigger project will give the community some insight on, is there an actual sex ratio imbalance?
Okay, so no sneak peeks for now.
Unfortunately not, but I hope that that paper is out really soon. It was a
Uh,
very big undertaking, so it's taking some time. Um, but I guess the sneak peek is that it is a worthwhile read. It's not exactly, some of the things are surprising. Some of the
okay.
data.
All right, great. So we're going to move on to a segment we do here called the MoPod lightning round, where I'm just going to fire off some quick questions and you tell me the first thing that comes to your mind. You ready?
Okay,
Will the Shidduch crisis ever end?
I don't know.
What season of the year do most people go on dates?
Summer.
What is your favorite place to get coffee?
There's a new place called Pati's that opened in the neighborhood.
Oh yeah, I haven't been there yet, but yeah, I heard. Okay. Which community would you say has the Shidduch crisis the worst?
Hmm, unsure.
Which state in the United States would you most like to visit?
Um, well, I'll just say I was recently in Nashville for one night and it was great.
All right, great. Which color blue do you prefer, sky blue or ocean blue?
Ocean blue.
Thank you, Dr. Naomi Rosenbach, for coming on the MoPod. Anything else you want our listeners to know before we sign off?
Um, uh, just that it's been my pleasure to sort of be behind gathering these voices, and I hope to continue doing this sort of research in all different areas when it comes to problems within the Orthodox community.
All right, great. And please send over the research once it's published so that we can share the stats and share your findings, because it's definitely going to be interesting to a lot of our listeners and a lot of the MoDay community as a whole. So definitely would love to see that. Thanks again for coming on. Pump the volume.
Sure.